And Alexx is going to be doing our sermon today. So passing it over to you, Alexx, and just let me know when I can advance the slides.
Will do. All right, well, good morning, everyone. I'm gonna go through this. I have a lot written out and I had a ton more written out and I had to cut it down. So I'm working through this and just I've always found comfort in stories and always connected with stories. So that's part of the reason I wanted to be able to share my own story here with you guys, mostly as it relates to and loss. Some of you may know parts of it, but you probably don't know all of it. So I wanted to be able to share that to the best of my ability. So in the summer of 2014, my sister and her wife told me that they were going to try to have a child. And John and I agreed that we really enjoyed growing up with cousins our own age. It was a lot of fun. So maybe we would start thinking about children. We decided that we didn't need to, actively try, but we could just see how things went. And by September, I was taking a pregnancy test and I found out I was pregnant with Kellen. Can go to the next slide. So my sister ultimately didn't have success with IVF. They started looking at adoption, and my nephew was adopted about 11 months after Kellen was born. And then my niece was adopted a year after that. Right before Kellen turned 2, we started talking about their baby. And so I jumped headfirst into this. I'm a planner, and so I started tracking and figuring things out. Pretty sure my timing would mean that we'd have babies that were 3 years apart. That was the plan. We're all allowed our naive thoughts, right? So it took 6 months before I would see a positive pregnancy test, and it happened in September, and it put me on a pregnancy trajectory that was 1 day off from Kellen's. He was due on June 6th. This baby would be due on June 7th. The timing couldn't have been more perfect, and I could see it all coming together. So I got a big brother book for Kellen and told John the news. If you want to go to the next slide. Fast forward about a month to a Saturday in October. We just got a pumpkin farm and we told my sister the news. And later that day, I saw a small amount of blood. I was worried. I tried to call my OB, who was closed because it was Saturday afternoon. So I called my sister, I called my aunt for their advice. They told me nothing to worry about, but I was still worried. So we went to the ER later that night and found out it was a miscarriage and I was no longer pregnant. I stayed in bed for probably the next day and a half and put John in charge of telling everyone who already knew. I had just told my coworkers at work that week, so he borrowed my phone and texted the one I was close with to let them know. I went to school on Monday. It was a professional development day. I didn't think I had a good reason to stay home, but I was in tears within the first hour, and my principal pulled me aside and kindly told me to go home. I really wish someone had told me that it was okay and probably necessary to take more time off than I did. About 3 weeks after that, the teacher next door to me walked into my room in the morning to tell me that she was pregnant. She was due the week before I would have been, and my heart dropped. I started to tear up, but I tried to tell her I was happy for her. And then this began kind of the rest of the agonizing school year that I went through. I stopped eating with my coworkers at lunch because the conversations turned to her pregnancy and babies. I would go in my classroom at the end of the day. As soon as the last student left, I sat in silence during our required team meetings. I kept my makeup bag in my purse so that when I cried at school, I could fix it. I tried really hard to hide it, but I was grieving and in pain. This was my routine for about 6 weeks. When one of my coworkers approached me in the break room at lunch, and all she said was, "I'm worried about you." And it made me start crying. This was my life at the moment, working next door to a teacher that was the embodiment of what I had lost and trying to keep it hidden from everyone else. Then Christmas happened and it was horrible. It's a holiday that celebrates a miraculous birth, and it was supposed to be when we were telling everyone about our pregnancy. So it was not good. I hid out in bedrooms instead of talking to my relatives. The day after Christmas, I packed up all our Christmas decorations. John was at work and he got home. He kind of raised his eyebrows around the Christmas house, and I just told him I'm done with Christmas now. There was some tension as we talked less and less. We had a really trying argument, and I told him I would try to find a therapist to talk to. I had no idea how to go about this. I'd never done this, I'd never been to a therapist. I didn't know how to do this. The first therapist that I went to left me feeling really tense and unheard, so I found someone else to go to. In March, I saw a different therapist, one who'd worked as a grief counselor on the maternity ward. And I left that first meeting feeling validated and heard. And I started to make sense of what I'd gone through. In July, John and I had a consultation meeting with a fertility specialist. After about 3 weeks after this meeting, I found out I was pregnant again. This joy was short-lived though, and ended in a miscarriage about 2 weeks later. This left me more panicked about what was going on. After our first miscarriage, the nurses and doctors at my OB office had given me positive and mostly dismissive comments that just happens sometimes, you're young, there's not much chance of this happening again. And yet here I was, 18 months into our journey with 2 pregnancies. So we worked with our fertility doctor to figure out what to do next. Decided to try an IUI, which is an intrauterine insemination. This brought us into the world of fertility treatments, time shots, although it was just one for an IUI, frequent ultrasounds, awkward semen collections, and 2-week wait. We tried this 3 times in 4 months with no success. It was after this 3rd time we were able to probe a little deeper and find out that I have a blood clotting disorder that can cause recurrent miscarriages. It left me with a supposed answer, but also a question of how it was having such an impact now, and not at all with Kellen's pregnancy. The question now became if we should pursue IVF. It was such a struggle to decide. When I was in a position to get pregnant on my own, I was able to get pregnant on my own. I wasn't able to stay pregnant now, but I had had a successful pregnancy. So do we gamble and see if this will work out on its own, or do we take on IVF with high emotional and financial price tag? I was so torn, but we finally decided on trying one more IUI with different medication and then moving into IVF if it didn't work. And it didn't work, so we tried our first round of IVF. I was not excited about it. I felt terrified and embarrassed that we needed to go through IVF. We muddled through our 2 weeks of multiple shots a day. During this process of going through the shots, my grandmother passed away. I knew it was coming, I knew it was going to happen, but the timing was still heartbreaking. Dealing with the loss of my last grandparent while we were juggling shots, hormones, and appointments was a lot. I even had to leave the luncheon after the funeral to go to a monitoring appointment at the fertility clinic. So this led up to the day of our egg retrieval. John's appointment was early in the morning, followed by mine mid-morning. After the procedure, the nurse told us that they had retrieved 10 eggs, and that was promising, so we went home to wait. The next day, we learned that 6 of the eggs had fertilized. We had to wait to see how many of the embryos would continue to grow. The day of the egg transfer, or the embryo transfer, I went to the appointment alone. We were now on our 5th round of fertility treatments, and by this point, we had to make difficult decisions about both of us taking time off work. In hindsight, it was hard to go alone. I wish I had John with me. When I arrived, the nurse informed me that they had 1 for the transfer, 1 to freeze, and they were watching 3 more that were borderline. They didn't end up growing into embryos. I didn't ask that day why we weren't transferring 2. I kind of wish I had. The procedure itself wasn't long, included a pipette with the embryo and following along on the ultrasound. The nurse handed me a plastic petri dish with my name and the date on it. "Your baby's first home," she exclaimed. And first tangible piece of evidence besides a pregnancy test that I'd ever gotten. I was set to come in 2 weeks later for blood work. I was doing daily injections of a blood thinner to combat my blood clotting disorder. A few days before that time, before I was supposed to come back, there was some bleeding. So I called and asked to come in early for the blood work so I could my HCG levels. It's a hormone that measures pregnancy levels. They came back high enough to be pregnant, but lower. So I was set to come back again and again. This continued for 9 days over the Memorial Day weekend. The blood work showed rising levels, but not the doubling that they wanted to see until it started to drop. And this confirmed what deep down I already knew what had happened, that this embryo was not going to stay. This was a huge blow for me because IVF was supposed to be our best chance. We were young, substantial medical issues, and we had spent so much money for it all to go wrong. I felt like a failure that it didn't work, and I wasn't really prepared for this outcome. I knew it was a possibility, but I felt like I was sure that this was going to work for us, and it didn't. There's a lot of despair as I tried to process everything that happened. I felt like my body was working against the thing I wanted most. I knew I needed a break from IVF, so we stopped for the time. I applied for a grant to try to continue with IVF, which we didn't get. It was about this time that I started seeing a therapist again. The grief that I was experiencing was still hard, and I knew I'd need help to process everything. I was also starting back up because I wanted to work through the emotions of letting go of that second child that I wanted so badly. I was convinced that it wasn't going to happen, and I was just destined to incur a series of miscarriages. There's a moment, sorry guys, there's a moment in therapy that will stay with me. We tried some visualizations and EMDR therapy, which some of you may have heard of. It's a way of processing trauma. And so in doing this, I was asked to picture a calm place. And I pictured sitting on a beach, lounging on a chair. And in the distance, I could see John returning to me, walking along the shoreline. He was holding Kellen's hand, and he was carrying a toddler boy with blonde curls. As we talked through this after, my therapist said, "This is what your heart desires. It's showing through." This happened in October, before we'd moved forward, with our second transfer, before we knew effort would exist. And this moment, it still gives me chills to think about. In November, we decided to move forward with IVF again. At this point, I just needed to know how this was going to go. We had that second embryo that was frozen, and I needed to know if this was going to work. It was really scary to move forward, though, because this was our safety net. This was our backup plan. And if it didn't work, that was it. I'd have to come to terms with having just one child. The second transfer was less involved because we weren't collecting eggs this time, just transferring a frozen embryo. So it took place on November 20th. I asked John to take the day off so he could be there. We took home another plastic petri dish and started the wait. I was a bundle of nerves during this time. I was terrified of what could happen, what I knew could happen. The morning before I would get my blood drawn, I took a pregnancy test, and it was positive. I mentioned this in passing to the nurse who drew my blood, and she responded by clucking her tongue and saying, "That's why we tell you not to take a pregnancy test before. You never know if it's the shots." She made me question the test in my head, even though I knew that I hadn't taken any shots with HCG this time. That happens during a fresh transfer, not a frozen one. The results from the blood draw were promising, and even more promising 2 days later. My numbers were good, more than doubled from the last test, somewhere around 1,200. For reference, a home pregnancy test turns positive with an HCG level of 25. So I was officially pregnant and still terrified. If you want to go to the next slide. I'd been here before, and it was hard to be joyful. I had a sense of dread every time I went to the bathroom. I overanalyzed every feeling in my body. We'd go for our 2-week ultrasound, and I had planned for the worst that day. But when the doctor started up the ultrasound, I saw the white flickering of a heartbeat, and I was overwhelmed with relief. This happened a week before Christmas. I pushed myself a little by little. Kellen got a picture with Santa announcing that he was going to be a big brother. I knew that I'd have to put that picture away if it wasn't true. We told my extended family at Christmas, even though we were only 8 weeks along. Each time I held my breath and waited for something to go wrong. Small exhales and baby steps to the next milestone. Luckily, I got to see the baby every 2 weeks at the fertility clinic as they were monitoring me for most of the first trimester. It was such a relief. There was a constant anxiety during my pregnancy. I didn't trust my body to do what it was supposed to do. I was always checking to see if things were okay. This was exacerbated by having my placenta attach in the front, which basically cushioned any kicks or movements that I might feel. And then COVID happened. I was 19 weeks along, and I was terrified of catching it and causing harm to the baby. Every fear I had came back to this fear of losing the baby, and it didn't really go away. I could breathe a little easier at different points, but it didn't take the fear away. I was still seeing my therapist through this every 2 weeks and every 4 weeks to help. And it did help reframe my anxiety and help me understand it. I also had to grieve the idea of how my pregnancy would go because COVID changed everything. I knew this would likely be my last time being pregnant and something I'd wanted for the better part of 3 years. But I didn't get to have the same pregnancy experience I was expecting. I didn't get to be the pregnant woman in public. If you've ever watched a pregnant woman walk into a public space, people turn and smile, they hold doors for them, they ask them about their baby. And I've been watching this for 3 years, mostly with jealousy of this happening. And I didn't get to have this experience. My one public experience happened at 36 weeks when I was taking a walk in the neighborhood, and a neighbor down the street called from her porch, "When are you due?" And I got to answer, "August 7th. That was it. We had saved our baby items from Kellen, so I wasn't planning on having any sort of baby shower, but that would have been hard too with COVID. And I know a lot of people had to go without a baby shower during their pregnancy with COVID. I know it's not the most upsetting thing that can happen, but it was still an expectation that didn't go as planned. At my 38-week appointment, I found out that the baby was breech with at least 1 foot down. So my doctor wanted me to come back the next day so he could check it out, but my labor started that night. So we ended up at the hospital the next morning, wherever it was born by C-section. And hearing that baby cry was such a relief. He was finally here, safe in my arms. I'm gonna go to the next slide. Going through infertility was one of the hardest things I've ever done. It created monumental shifts in my life, some good, some bad, and I'm a changed person from who I was before. I'm carrying scars with me that will remind me of all I've been through. I know that the details of our stories may not be the same or even similar, but I think we can always find ways to relate in the emotion. And I hope you found a way to relate to my story. I used to tell myself that I was going through a season of infertility and this wouldn't last forever. It was hard to believe that in the midst of it. But at this point in time, it feels done. It feels like that part is somewhat in the past. But in other ways, it's always going to be a part of my life. I had a lot of realizations and moments of truth in this journey. So I wanted to share those with you. Having no end in sight when you're trying to get pregnant can be incredibly exhausting. Month after month of trying for a baby and no way of knowing how long this was going to continue. Would it last 2 years, 3, 7? That notion's exhausting and hard to contend with. I was also thinking, how many miscarriages would I endure? A third miscarriage gets you this diagnosis of recurrent miscarriages and usually means there's an underlying issue causing this to happen. I was so scared that I would just keep adding miscarriages to the list. Trying to get pregnant month after month is also emotionally draining. It starts with the disappointment, then planning and tracking and waiting and doing it all over again. And once you're in this cycle, it's really hard to step away from. At least it was for me. If I tried to skip a month of trying, I was missing a chance to get pregnant. Infertility and trying to get pregnant comes with its own unique emotions, but it gets more complicated when you add in pregnancy loss. Go to the next slide. As a society, we don't seem to consider miscarriage a death, but if life begins in the womb at the moment of conception, as so many people claim, then a death in the womb should be treated as a death. No one really said to me, "I'm sorry your baby died." And because we don't treat it that way, it's often minimized. I heard a lot of these statements. At least you can get pregnant. At least you have Kellen. At least it was early. At least you didn't have to have a D&C procedure. At least is not a compassionate way to start a sentence when you're comforting someone. We need to stop minimizing other people's grief. Worse than minimizing someone's pain is to hint blame on the mother. Are you under a lot of stress right now? Are you eating organic foods? My first therapist asked me this one. Now that you're taking this blood thinner, this won't happen again, right? This came from my aunt. This leads so many mothers to ask, what did I do wrong? Myself included. I agonized over what I could have done differently each time, grasping for answers that I never really got. And because I didn't have those answers, I usually came to the conclusion that it was my fault. Something was wrong with me that caused this. I've come to learn that over half of miscarriages are caused by chromosomal abnormalities in the embryo, meaning that the embryo never could have turned into a viable baby. I can't say that the self-blame is completely gone, but it's far more resolved than it was 2 and 3 years ago. Grieving a miscarriage is a solitary and complicated thing. It usually happens before you have any sort of big announcement, so you're left to decide how to tell people around you the news. For me, it was hard to talk about. If there was any communication about it, it was John calling or texting for me. I didn't have the strength to talk about it immediately after. And if you have made a pregnancy announcement, you have to quickly decide how to publicly share what just happened to you. Can we go to the next slide? Traditional ways of grieving death don't really translate to a miscarriage, and we don't have sacred ways of honoring these babies. There's not usually physical items or photos, and if you do have photographs, the only photographs you'd ever have of your child, the world doesn't think it's proper to share these. And there's no honor to the remains. For me, I knew when I passed the baby, and I didn't know what to do about it. It was overwhelming, and I didn't do anything to retrieve it from the bathroom, and that makes me sad. There's not normally funerals or memorial services held for lost babies. I held a memorial service with John when I planted a tree in our backyard. I wrote a letter and placed it in the dirt with the roots. I also planted 3 rose bushes in our backyard after the 3rd miscarriage. One mother had written, "My baby deserves so much more than a Facebook eulogy." These small moments are all we get. Grief continues on, even when other people have returned to normal. Often those feelings of grief wash back up at unexpected moments. People will ask, "What's wrong?" not understanding that months later, it's still the pain of losing a baby that causes this. Due dates Lost dates, seeing pregnant women or babies, pregnancy announcements were all triggers, sometimes expected, usually not. When you experience a profound loss like this, your world is changed, shattered. Things don't go back to normal. Other people's lives are minimally changed. They can express their sympathy and then return to their normal lives. Most people do. They'll ask for a few weeks and then stop. In fact, some people try really hard not to mention it. They don't bring it up because they don't want to remind you. But sometimes bringing it up invites the person to remember and honor the loss. You can say, I've been thinking about you. How are you doing since your loss? Next slide. I had heard a helpful description of grief as a ball in a box with a button. At the beginning, the ball is huge and it takes up the whole box. And as it moves around, it's constantly hitting the pain button. Over time, the ball gets smaller, but it's still just as painful when it does hit the button. I found this really helpful to think about as I was going through this. It's not always helpful to compare your grief to others. Someone else's grief will always seem worse than yours, but that doesn't make yours less valid. It was helpful to speak with other women who'd experienced pregnancy loss. It felt like a secret club that nobody wanted to join. Once I talked about it, I learned of so many others who'd been through it too that I had no idea about. Some of them talked publicly about their miscarriages, but others did not. It's hard to understand the devastation of a loss unless someone's gone through it themselves. I certainly didn't understand it before it happened. Next slide. Even if you haven't experienced something like this, know that there are better things to say to someone who's experienced a loss. The at least statements are terrible. Stop saying it was meant to be, or this was God's plan, or everything happens for a reason. No reason you can provide makes this death seem reasonable. Maybe instead we can say things like, I don't know what you're going through, but I'm here for you. Or if you'd like to share your story and feelings with me, I'd love to listen. I'm deeply sorry for your loss. I'm holding you in my heart during this time. Or how are you doing since your loss? A lot of people would say, you're so strong for going through this. And I came to hate hearing this phrase, as if I was given a choice in the matter. I didn't choose for my world to fall apart. And I didn't have any other choice but to pick it up and keep going. I certainly didn't feel strong through all this. It became a code phrase for, I can't imagine going through what you're going through, but I'm glad it's not me. I would also hear a lot of miracle stories from well-meaning people, telling me stories of women who got pregnant naturally after 10 years of trying, or pregnant immediately after their IVF babies. These are things to be celebrated, surely, but it's not always helpful to hear these, or to say, never give up hope. The positive stories are the ones that get told. Other stories are usually held silently. My sister had said, you have to make peace with your decisions. That doesn't always mean trying for a baby, no matter what. I can't say what we would have done if our second transfer didn't work, but I'm not sure we would have gone through the whole process of IVF again. Our story ended with Everett, and I had little control over that outcome. We have very little control over the way things go. We all think we have a lot more control than we do, and we usually congratulate ourselves when things go right, thinking we did something to cause it. But any sense of control is usually falsely constructed on luck or privilege. I had a lot of beliefs shattered during this process, a lot of them surrounding mental health. I dealt with depression during this, and it changed many beliefs I didn't realize I had. It's okay to struggle with mental health. It doesn't define you. It doesn't mean you'll always struggle. You may just need help from time to time as you process the circumstances you're going through. I had seen 4 different therapists throughout these 3 years, and most of them were validating and helpful. I had to attach value to asking for help and admitting that I couldn't fix this myself, which was hard and reminded me of a quote from Brené Brown. Next slide. She says, when you judge yourself for needing help, you judge those you are helping. When you attach value to giving help, you attach value to needing help. The danger of tying your self-worth to being a helper is that you feel shame when you have to ask for help. Offering help is courageous and compassionate, but so is asking for help. I had to sort through a lot of these pain and emotions. I believed some terrible things right after my miscarriage, that this was my fault, that I did something to cause this, that I was broken. My mind was a vicious place to be. And I tried to convince people I was okay when I wasn't. Emotions are not good nor bad, but how we react to them can be. For me, I felt a lot of resentment and jealousy during this process, mostly because of how my school year went right after my first miscarriage. I don't think it's fair to tell people not to feel the way they feel. My therapist would say, as I was talking, to quit shoulding myself when I would say I should be happy for her, my latest pregnant friend, but I wasn't. And that was okay. I didn't need to shame myself for the emotions I was feeling. This experience also tested our marriage. I wish more people were honest about the struggles in their relationships that they go through instead of viewing it as weakness and keeping it silent. I think it would be so helpful to understand you're not alone in these struggles. It was a relief to me when I read in Becoming that Michelle and Barack Obama went to marriage counseling. We did too for a few sessions. It was enough to clear the air and recognize what each other was going through. Grief rarely leaves any relationship the same because grief changes us so suddenly and we grieve in different ways. It can bring you closer. It may feel like I'm finished with this journey in some ways. I have the 2 children that I wanted, but the truth is that this still feels unfinished. It may always feel this way. It's hard to relate to people who talk about the decisions they made in regards to their children. How many years between them, how many to have, even the time of year to have a baby. It's often discussed by teachers. It's hard because these decisions were made for me. I didn't get to choose how far apart my kids were. I didn't get to choose to have them 5 years apart. That wasn't the original plan. Although it is nice that we've seemed to escape the chaotic parenting that occurs when your kids are close in age. People often ask me if having 2 kids is crazy. And the truth is, it's not as bad as I thought it would be. But that's honestly because Kellen's 5, turning 6. We don't have a toddler and a baby at the same time. I don't feel done with this journey, but I also know that being open to more children likely means more miscarriages. And I'm not sure if I'm willing to do that. I know that we're not going to pay for IVF again, but a part of me will always want that miraculous 3rd pregnancy, the chance to possibly raise a girl. And people don't miss a chance to ask, as if it's any of their business if we're going to have more kids or try for a girl. The first time I was asked this was 24 hours after Everett was born by a labor and delivery nurse who came in and found out we had 2 boys. She asked if we were going to have a 3rd. I don't know if we're going to try for a 3rd baby, but I do know that my 2 boys fill my heart. So I think I can be content if the answer is to be done. I just have to make peace with that decision. Thank you guys for letting me share my story and my thoughts with you today.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Harmony UU podcast. Check us out online at harmonyuu.org for more details. You can also find us on Facebook. Just search Harmony UU. If you're in the Cincinnati area, please stop by one of our services on the 1st and 3rd Sunday of each month at 10 a.m.